And okay, so I'm not on mute. So
Oh, good, Anisa. I can hear you loud and clear.
okay, is this better? Is
Oh,
this better?
all clear, yes.
All right, great. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to today's episode of E27 webinar. Hello, my name is Anisa from the E27 content team. So before we begin, I'd like to explain a little about the E27 webinar. So we started the E27 webinar series to facilitate learning and development of the startup community in Southeast Asia. Every 2 weeks, we bring in expert speakers from the region to share their experiences and best practices on contemporary challenges. Kindly note that this session is recorded and we will be sharing the video post in our site later. So today, we are going to discuss about corporate venture building in Southeast Asia, why it matters, and why this is actually the best time to look into the sector. And to explain this, we have not one, but 3 speakers who are going to give us all the details about corporate venture building. So first of all, I'd like all of you to give a warm welcome to Joachim Van Dale, founding partner at FutureLabs. Hi, Joachim, how are
Good
you?
afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. And then we also have Ziv Ragowski, a venture partner also at FutureLabs Ventures.
Hello,
Hi, Ziv.
today. Hello.
Hi, hello. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, great. And last but not least, we also have Tamana Dahia, Venture Director, also at FutureLabs Ventures. Hi, Tamana.
Hello, good afternoon.
All right, great. It's so great to see all of you here. So yes, I will not take too much of your time. So let's just start this. So over to you, Joachim.
Yes, that's my cue indeed. Thank you so much, Anisa. Thank you, E27, for having us. And most of all, thank you everyone for tuning in. Real pleasure to have you. Look, I wanted to start just by taking 10 minutes to demystify the concept of corporate venturing a little bit. We don't have that much time, but also explain why it matters to you. And that is whether you're an entrepreneur, you're a corporate executive, or an investor. Look, you will agree that in today's world, surviving as a large, established corporate is almost impossible without an innovation strategy, or even better, a culture of innovation, a constant culture of innovation. And this is in part true because maturing industries have trouble keeping up with the accelerating digital pace. They're challenged by new entrants, startups, and others. And they are increasingly overtaken by the rise of digital ecosystems, which really blur the lines between industries. So competition is coming in from all angles. And as a result, there's an increasing pressure on revenue streams, you understand that, and therefore also the lifespan, the very lifespan of the existing business model is constantly decreasing. So corporates who experience these pressures, what they do is they typically start by looking at a basic premise, that is that the first step in innovating is to strengthen the existing business, it's to defend, right? And in corporate lingo, that means you improve your operational efficiencies, you milk your cash cow, you stretch the revenue generating capabilities and what have you. Research indicates that most organizations spend around 50 to 80% of all their innovation efforts on these innovation efforts at the core innovation. Returns, however, are often incremental at best, and they don't dramatically advance the business nor increase the long-term survival rate of the business. So there has been in the last decade a significant shift towards a second frontier of innovation, which is essentially about extending the core capabilities of the organization and seeking adjacent innovations, which can be bolted on that core capability. And we've all seen the rise of corporate incubators, corporate accelerators, through which large enterprises want to, perhaps in best case, learn from and collaborate with startups, and at worst, borrow their ideas. Corporate venture building is the newest evolution of that, the third frontier. And simply put, in this bucket, we find initiatives which aspire to completely reinvent the business, or even invent a new business altogether. There's an audacious goal behind this, right? The audacious goal is to build a venture which has the potential to become just as big as the core business. Now that's a big statement, and indeed it requires anyone involved in sponsoring and executing on such a vision to be just as bold, just as driven, and perhaps just as crazy as an entrepreneur has to be in the wild. Yeah. So with 25 to 30% of innovation budgets currently being invested in corporate venturing, the reality is that corporates now around the world are moving beyond the question why into the question how do we do this? And more than that, there's also a growing list of successful corporate ventures that make it to market. And we'll talk about some of them later on, but just to mention a few names here on the slide, you can see them, Ovo, Eureka. And the last example we mentioned because it shows that these ventures truly have the potential to become as large as the original core business. As in the case of Moody's Analytics, it represents 50% of the market cap. And in part, we mention it because FutureLabs finds a part of its origin there. On the next slide, answering the questions on how corporate ventures build, it's important to learn from ventures in the wild. Look, we can talk at length about our lessons on how we build as entrepreneurs and how that's fundamentally different than how a consultant would do it. But before that, I think we need to talk about the importance of setting a baseline for how and also when a corporate should invest in line with the market. And that starts by embracing some of the VC venture capital principles and by recognizing that a great business like the ones mentioned here on the slide are started by investing relatively small amount of money. This is important because as a corporate, you have to refrain from a classic corporate reflex, which we see happening way too often, which is it goes something like this. We have lots of money. I mean, we typically move around big budgets. So let's make a business plan to justify that we should spend lots of money because that will maximize the chances of us building a great business, a great venture. Not quite true, especially in times like these, you really want to benchmark your investment. And that benchmark tells us that by investing around $2 million, you can bring a venture into Series A. Another related insight here is that if you're looking for the biggest dollar return as an investor and as a corporate, you invest in your ventures, you want to get into a venture, invest into a venture as early as possible. Now, this is true, providing, of course, that the venture makes it to Series A. And this is where an external corporate venture builder comes into play, Taman. Having an understanding of the corporate side helps for sure. Having an understanding of, or having rather consulting ability and advisory ability helps. But what really matters is the investor, the startup mindset. And looking at the market, looking at the corporates that we have engaged with, the true entrepreneurial ability is the key differentiation factor here. As a corporate, you want to make the right investment at the right time into the right business. And you need to be able to leverage the assets in the best possible way, but you also need to learn really from the entrepreneurs. Because if you do that well, you will ultimately dramatically increase the probabilities of success. From 1/500 chance of building a $100 million business to 1/8. 1/500 compared to 1/8. And that is a statistic that should even make the die-hard independent entrepreneurs think. If we unpack those numbers a little more, on the next slide, we see that corporate-backed ventures typically raise on higher valuations, up to 80% higher actually, that they have half the failure rate, and that they come with an exit premium of nearly 40%, all compared to ventures in the wild. These are staggering numbers, and therefore it should not surprise you that of the 14 unicorns that were born in Southeast Asia over the last few years, almost all of them have at least one corporate backer. This number also tells us that in Southeast Asia, large companies, conglomerates in many cases, control a lot of the key resources related to distribution, sales channels, supplies, networks, and what have you. And each of those resources give what VCs and entrepreneurs like to call that unfair advantage to the ventures that those corporates build or invest in. So if you're a corporate, especially here in Southeast Asia, who is looking to build a new value pool and concerned about long-term survival and competition and what have you, you really have a huge opportunity on your hands. Yes, it will require you to assume, to embrace a lot of entrepreneurial risk, but that really can be mitigated by adopting proven methods on how to build a venture, apply stage-gated financing, and work with a corporate venture builder. And therefore, we believe that venture building has a prominent place in the portfolio of a corporate innovator. Tamana, over to you to help us to compare this corporate venture building model against some of the alternatives enterprises have.
Thank you, Joachim. Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we would like to spend a little bit of time now that you have an understanding of corporate venture building model to understand from your perspective, how does this compare to the other approaches maybe that you are driving in your organization, or being in part of this ecosystem you're probably quite familiar with. So these are typically when an organization is thinking about exploring innovation, new models, new technologies. They are thinking often about accelerators, maybe creating an internal incubator. Many of the corporates now are actually having corporate venture capital funds as well. And what we would like to discuss is, where venture building fits in and how does this compare to these well-known models. So we've created a small survey. If you can just take a few seconds to either on your phone or on this laptop that you're using at the moment, just go to menti.com and enter this code that you see here, and you will see 3 questions come up. And the questions are on the 3 options you see here: corporate accelerator, incubator, venture capital. And it asks you to rate it in terms of the impact and in terms of the risk and speed to market. So of course we have an opinion on it, but we would like to first see as well what you think about it before we share our perspective. And we would be happy to actually have more questions around that later. I think in our webcast, we have about 15-20 minutes at the end for Q&A as well. So while you're doing it, hopefully you're already there and answering those questions. Make sure after you finish one, you click to go to the next one, because there are 3 questions, so that you answer all 3, not just one. For those of you who are looking for a quick definition to confirm your understanding, accelerators are where corporates identify a few topics and then bring in a partner who helps them screen or select a few startups to work with them on those topics, where the focus is really doing proof of concepts together, engaging with internal experts and teams to test those technologies. So it's a great way for them to test those. And it typically also comes with some amount of investment and taking a stake in those startups. Internal incubator, pretty much when you encourage your employees to come up with new ideas and build them out. And corporate venture capital is where corporates have created a fund to invest in external startups. So hopefully you have had a moment to do that, and I'd like to switch to what the responses are like. Let me see, I don't see them here. So let me see here. Great, so I can see here about 9 responses coming in. And we see on the accelerator side, impact. So this is obviously going on a scale from 1 to 6. A bit of medium impact, more of a reputation impact. That's quite interesting. And speed to market is quite high. That's interesting. On the internal incubator, most of you think, well, that's interesting. So many of you have actually said risk of failure is much higher here in terms of incubators. And in impact, especially strategic impact, cultural impact, you don't see much difference. Just please make sure, I'll keep this survey open even later, and we'll be happy to share the results with anybody who's interested. Make sure to click next, because I see lesser people have answered this than the first one. So make sure to go on and answer these. And the last one here is corporate venture capital. And it's interesting here, of course, you see lower risk of failure with this one, but you also see lower impact coming in here. So it's an interesting, I think many of these observations actually align with what I'm going to share now as well. in terms of how we see it. So we really see corporate accelerators and incubators are a great way for internal teams to learn about new models. And for that reason, you do see quite a bit of cultural impact generated, a lot of engagement, opening up of mind, testing, or getting familiar with new models. But we do see them in terms of strategic impact or kind of the results that they deliver. It takes a long time. And in terms of speed to market as well, they can be fairly slow just because of the dependence on existing teams to take those forward. So where we think corporate venture building really differentiates from these existing approaches is higher strategic impact, because it starts very much with a few topics where there is high strategic interest, and very much aligns itself with corporate assets where the corporate has a strong position and can build out from those. And because of the combination, I think Joachim explained how we combine corporate assets and startups, skills and mindset together. Because of that, the speed to market that you see in these approaches is much higher as well. So that's where we think corporate venture building actually has a role to play, especially when you're looking at those Horizon 3 initiatives. So things that are very new for the corporate, looking at disruptive models or completely new business models. Corporate venture building has a very clear advantage over some of the existing approaches. What does that approach how does that play out practically in terms of driving it in the organization? Of course, like any innovation approach, it starts with what is the idea or what's the opportunity that we want to drive. In many cases, corporates may have that already identified through different ways, and if that's done so venture building can actually start with the validation itself. But in many cases, we also go in and start right from ideation. So we work with the partner to first identify those opportunities that they have a strong unfair advantage given their corporate assets, that have a strong strategic fit with where they see the future of their industry and their business. And then we work to actually validate these in the market, bringing in entrepreneurial talent here already, and then starting to identify what's the best way to take this forward to market. We are neutral in terms of building it from scratch or actually looking at an existing startup that may have some of this technology existing and may actually accelerate the go-to-market. So we are neutral here in terms of building from scratch or leveraging an existing startup, creating a strategic partnership to bring this new idea to the market. So the journey can take anywhere from 12 to 18 months, depending on where we are starting. But as the entrepreneurs and as the venture builders, we are happy to basically start in the journey wherever the venture is at a particular moment. If I take an example here, just to close with this on what is corporate venture building, I think one of the case studies, we have a lot of details on this on our website for those of you who are curious. We have some videos about it as well. But one of the case studies we have here in Singapore is with ING. And just to explain their thinking on why they undertook this venture building journey, ING is one of the most innovative banks in the world, and they've won a lot of awards even recently on how innovative they are. But what they wanted to do, apart from doing all the fintech partnerships, was also create a lab that explores really the Horizon 3 ideas. So they created this lab, which we partnered with them in setting up and in executing. They created this lab really to look at how they can create completely new product services, embedding themselves much closer to their customer value chains, and also engage the entrepreneurial talent. So go outside of ING boundaries to engage external talent and engage the external ecosystem here to create these new products and services. And so that's what we worked with them over a period of 12 to 18 months. We created a portfolio of new ventures as well as partnerships. And one of them right now has got already ING Venture Capital CVC fund has invested in them, making that a more strategic relationship. And two of them right now are in the market looking at how to sort of scale and go forward. So that's an example of how a corporate who wants to bring in, Exploring Horizon 3 has worked with us in doing so. So the next step we really want to talk about, having explained this model, is what are the opportunities we're seeing in Southeast Asia and why we think it's a great time for actually considering corporate venture building in this region. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Ziv.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara. So I think this slide is pretty familiar to all of you, right? Why Southeast Asia? Well, we all are here. And what we see here within the context of Southeast Asia is that the region is growing very, very fast before COVID. And even within the COVID situation, there's still positive movement. If we look specifically, for example, even from a funding perspective, Traveloka just raised $250 million in the travel industry in the middle of COVID, just last week, I believe, right? As such, this is driven largely by a very young population. Median age is about 30, and the fact that the internet economy is quite significant here in Southeast Asia. If you look at the specific unicorns, as we said, as we mentioned earlier, actually many of them have at one point have been invested into by corporate ventures, by CVCs. In many cases, these corporate venture players have actually wanted to come in multiple times, and at the end, in many cases, have come in where the valuation has already been pretty high, right? Which is another reason for why is corporate venturing quite important. If we deep dive on the next slide to 3 markets, we've looked at Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia as the 3 largest, most relevant markets right now within the venture community. Although Vietnam and Thailand are very much catching up from behind. What you see is that Southeast Asia, and I think we all know this living here, is actually a pretty diverse group of countries. Even if you look at the differences between Singapore and Indonesia, where both of them have a fairly large number of unicorns, what you actually see is that the Singaporean unicorns are a mixture of regional players like Grab and Lazada and Sea, as well as, and this what you even see even more in funding, is technology plays like Trax as such, right? So for those of you who are not familiar, Trax is a technology for generating information from supermarkets and retail. Why is that important? Is because from a Singapore perspective, what you see is that the investment is moving towards more deep tech, more higher technology stuff that for now, at least, this is where the talent sits. This is where, this is where these opportunities are. And this is extremely relevant from a corporate venturing perspective, because this is actually an area where from a corporate venturing, you have, as corporates, you have actually a better set of assets to deploy. Versus if you look at Indonesia, a case in point, a lot of the players, a lot of the unicorns are marketplaces, whether it's a retail marketplace like Bukalapak, Tokopedia, and whatnot, or transportation marketplaces or similar to that in terms of Gojek. It's a very different strategy from an Indonesia perspective, because all of these players, and there's a lot of other players which we'll talk about in Indonesia in a minute, where a lot of these players have been tried to have before. But from a venture in the wild perspective, a Gojek won over Bluebird, which is the leading taxi company, right, in Indonesia, by developing a platform a bit faster. Tokopedia is won over a Blibli, which we'll talk about a bit later as well. Now, what is interesting, just to go back one slide, what is interesting also, if you look at GoPay and JD.ID, is that the unicorns that are in Indonesia are starting to generate their own unicorns as well. So if you think about it, GoPay is actually an outshoot of Gojek that raised investment independently, but is riding on its corporate parents' network of stores and GoFood and whatnot to develop, to develop itself. JD.ID has been developed also between JD in China, obviously a very large e-commerce, but quite well established as a partnership here within the Indonesian context. So what it tells you is that one, on the Singapore front, there is a lot more interested now in health tech, deep tech, and all of these things. That's what explains such a higher funding, right? Whereas in Indonesia, the current kind of sets of unicorns are largely marketplaces that really benefit from the large population that Indonesia is. Next page. I will be speaking a bit about Indonesia because this is where I'm located and I do most of my work. As we all know, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. You know, the GDP per capita is not so low for developing countries. However, you know, just today or in the last couple of days, they came out a Crediva report about e-commerce. And if you look at the people that are buying within the e-commerce realm, what you see is that the median or the average spend of those that have been surveyed, I think through 10 million transactions by Crediva, have actually been of a salary bands between, well, in US dollar terms, a little bit less than 700, even for the 55 ages and above. So even though the GDP per capita is about 4,000, the actual spending power of the people within Indonesia is significantly lower than that. Another couple of insights about Indonesia is that it is important that, especially those of you that don't live or haven't spent enough time in the country, consider the fact that when we often think of Indonesia, we think Jakarta, where in reality there's significant growth now in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, but they still have a long way to go until they reach the kind of the wealth level of Jakarta. Jakarta specifically has about 20 million out of the, or in fact, Jabodetabek, which is the area of Jakarta and the surrounding kind of suburbs, has about 20 million people out of the 267. So when you're starting to think about markets, you know, that is really a way to calibrate. Obviously, as we've seen earlier and here, Indonesia offers its sets of challenges. In terms of corporate ventures, OVO obviously is a very, very well-known corporate venture that has been very, very successful. And the reason why it's been very successful is because what the Lippo Group has been able to do is leverage their whole ecosystem, anywhere from their hospital chains to their malls, to really give OVO a right way of scaling up. So I think that's a great example of actually in the corporate venture building element, it's a great example of leveraging assets. So what I mean by that is very early on in the days of OVO, if you wanted to pay at a parking lot of the Lippo Mall, which is the largest you know, sets of malls in Indonesia, you would use your OVO. If you wanted to pay in a hospital or whatnot, you could use your OVO as well, which drove a lot of adoption. Eureka out of Indosat gives a very interesting other example of corporate venture, which is when to spin it off. So Eureka started actually very quickly with, you know, very early with Indosat, but very early within the, you know, the kind of the building of the venture, they've realized that as one telco, second or third largest telco in Indonesia, doesn't allow Eureka to achieve its mission of actually being the consumer analytics platform across, you know, across telcos. And so they quickly spun it off, and now they're actually quite independent. Blibli is an example of when, even though you have the market power, it doesn't always, you don't always win in a particular market, right? And this is where the entrepreneurial mindset, sometimes more so than the consulting mindset, is very important when you're building a corporate venture. What is not highlighted in this slide is Jarum is not only, for those of you who don't know, is not only the cigarette company, but they also own BCA, which is, you know, the largest bank in Indonesia, and I think by asset class, one of the largest in Southeast Asia. But even with all of that, Blibli, I think, is still within the top 5, but is never broken to, you know, to you know, the top 1 compared to a Lazada or Shopee or whatnot. And a lot of it comes to the fact of how do you manage a growth where the business is quite different than what your core business is, and you need the entrepreneurial mindset to push forward. I think that's enough for Indonesia. I'm happy to answer any more questions going forward. Tamara, back to you.
Thank you, Sif. I'll take a few minutes just to talk about Malaysia as well, as we are working here with a few of the corporate partners. And of course, Malaysia is one of those countries in the region where we see that as relatively quite well off. Pretty high GDP per capita. It's actually the third richest country in SEA. And when it comes to population, it doesn't really compare to Indonesia and the larger countries here in terms of population. So many times, you wonder as to what are some of the unique opportunities in Malaysia. And what I would like to, I think, drive attention to, what we're seeing a lot changing, and what is also highlighted in some of these examples that you see on this page, is around digital payments. So while in Malaysia, if you recall the overall page, we talked about underbanked in Malaysia is very small. And it's I think the unbanked population is only 15%, because the government actually does a wonderful job of opening accounts for people. But many people still continue to prefer using cash. So for most of the SMEs and so on, cash still reigns as king. And so the penetration in terms of using digital payments or even using digital banking has been quite low, and is one of the big focus areas for innovation here, and one that COVID has actually accelerated quite a bit. So while the SMEs all preferred to work with cash earlier, COVID has actually forced them to look at more of the cashless solutions, QR codes, and so on. So this is a behavior that we think would now that everybody is having to use it, would stick and would continue to be kind of bode well for more digital payment solutions. Also, a lot of this is focused on B2B, so SMEs comprise quite a large part of the the employment and GDP for the country. So a lot of these are focused on enabling digital payment solutions for smaller businesses and ultimately for consumers. The government has been launching a number of initiatives as well with regards to encouraging more of new startups. So there's new sandbox around a few of the focus industries as well. Bank Negara is also launching more of the digital banking guidelines and recently launched their eKYC guidelines. All of that basically prompting moving to more of digital banking and digital payments. So it's a big growth area in the country. And if I look at a few of the examples there, again, great examples of how companies have used their data and their assets to create completely new solutions. So for AirAsia, I think one of the most innovative companies here in Malaysia, the CEO talked about how they have a huge number of travelers database and what can we do to make their lives easier. And they thought about how can we encourage more of, as they go to other countries, how can they easily withdraw money, transfer money? This is a pain point as you travel out. And they decided to solve it through creating partnerships and through creating the sort of digital payments, remittances solution, which is what BigPay is. And it continues to grow its services and its sort of geographical footprint, but has been very successful for AirAsia. And the other two examples here from Axiata, probably most of you know as a telco player, has access to a lot of data. We just talked about Indosat as an example for Indonesia. So similar play here by Axiata, which created, so ADA is basically a retail insight. So ADA is a venture created on leveraging the data that Axiata has to give specific retail insights for customers, depending on what is interesting for them. And Boost being more of an e-wallet solution that they have launched, again, following on the trends. So that's what we see a lot accelerating and in Malaysia. And maybe a few comments on Singapore as well before we close.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Tamana. Let me quickly talk to Singapore. Indeed, look, I assume that most of you are familiar with Singapore and the type of corporates that are incorporated here, that are operating here. And therefore, you will also understand that the ventures corporates are looking to build are typically pan-region, especially in the B2C space. And they look for a regional scope or have a global focus. So there's a lot of that going on, for example, in the trade, in the logistics space, global technology, medtech, and what have you, where you per definition build for the world. These corporate ventures are born global. Yeah. Another focus is on B2B. large corporates serving other corporates here in the region, and developing new corporate initiatives, corporate venture building initiatives around this. There's a long and growing list of ventures now that start to come to market, that are built by corporates themselves or with our involvement or by our peers. I could have mentioned a few of those as well. But what is interesting maybe to point out for Singapore specifically is that it's really positioning itself as a hotbed for corporate venturing, right? And anyone who has been in Singapore long enough will understand how powerful rather such a commitment is. And I can't help but to see the parallel with the push that we've seen, to build the startup scene in 2011, 12, and the VC scene and what have you. Once the nation gets behind it, a lot of things become possible. And that agenda we see is driven, or a lot of that agenda is driven at least by EDB New Ventures, and that's a team that identifies opportunities for new venture creation in Singapore and enables these opportunities through making co-investments with the corporates, and also has built or is building a great venture building community on the back of this. Yeah. So it's great to see how they support and how they collaborate with venture builders like us. Also, an indication, I think, of a maturing ecosystem is to keep tabs with the academic, educational side. And there too, there's quite a lot of things happening. Noteworthy here is that INSEAD has planned a course on corporate venturing and innovation starting early February. And we are looking to bring 5 days of contents on how corporates can create, scale, integrate new businesses, and bring you some of the recent case studies I've been involved in as well. Yeah. So Anisa, with your permission, I'll take one more minute to conclude. Look, there's an ongoing shift with corporates from innovating at the core as a what I would call a strategic imperative to now innovating out of necessity. Yeah. Innovate now, venture out now, or you'll be irrelevant soon. And corporate venture building is increasingly accepted by the C-suite and by VCs as a powerful tool really to innovate. It brings that entrepreneurial mindset, that VC mindset, to the corporate, and hence can generate exceptional values, exceptional returns, providing, however, it's done right. And doing right means bringing the people in who are ready, who are willing and able to work with high uncertainty, with high risk. Typically, these are not consultants, and also give those people access and opportunity, but not too much money. Give them some money, but not too much. That doesn't necessarily correlate with success. Southeast Asia, as we talked about at length, has a structural economic fabric that favors corporate ventures. And lastly, there's probably no better time to get started than now, right? COVID puts in question how we all make sense of the world, and how we think about the role, the function of, and long-term survival of enterprises. And operating under this kind of pressure and in this ambiguity resembles, to us, much more the day-to-day reality of an entrepreneur, of a venture builder, more than what I have seen and experienced in many of the corporate headquarters, if you want. So, bringing those two worlds together and tapping into that, talent and in that drive and experience of the entrepreneurs is really, in our belief, what is going to drive the corporate venture building space, if you want, forward. Yeah. So very happy to take your questions. Thank you, Anisa. Back to you.
All right, thank you, Joaquin, Ziv, and Tamana. That was a very interesting discussion. So now we're moving on to the Q&A session. I think we have 15 minutes to answer these questions. And yeah, so we've seen questions coming in. So I think we can start with a question from Marco Macia. Hi, Marco. Thank you for the questions. So the question is, are you aware of corporate venture building with other technologies other than digital? Now, this is something that I also noticed. It seems like, especially in the 3 countries that we're talking about just now, the more popular sector seems to be e-commerce, logistics, or fintech. Is there any cases where they are approaching any other verticals other than these 2?
So maybe I'll try to answer this one. I think it's a great question. So the quick answer is yes, right? The longer answer is that digital, and I just had this discussion this morning with a partner. Digital is actually not the answer for most things, especially in a region like Southeast Asia. I mean, and especially maybe outside of Singapore. And so what you increasingly see is the need to combine either O2O, so offline to online, which means that there's a huge component of non-digital elements that need to be part of the venture building. And we see it because there's a lot of discussion right now around agricultural type ventures, as, you know, especially in the time of increased population and people need to eat. So streamlining food supply chain hasn't happened yet. And that for sure will require other technologies than just digital, right? It requires figuring out distribution to things like remote villages. It will require how do you engage with less sophisticated farmers, and how do you flatten supply chains that are made opaque for a reason. So I think that's one example, the agricultural elements. I think another good example that we're seeing increasingly discussions of, away from the e-commerce, away from the fintech, is a huge interest in sustainability type technologies and in understanding what is actually, how do we solve bigger problems in the world? And in reality, I think with the shift, and we've seen that in the adventure of the wild, even before COVID, that there's more and more scrutiny of what's been called kind of vanity metrics and eyeballs, and how are startups actually trying to help solve real problems. You will increasingly see opportunities, and you already have conversations about opportunities that are outside of the realm of pure digital, and it's sometimes digital at all, and more focused on problems that require a bit more of a combined problem solving activities. And actually, I think this is where corporate venturing is even more important, because if you're a startup entrepreneur in the wild, you need to raise money very, very quickly, other than, you know, otherwise you essentially die. And so you have less of a runway to try and solve problems that are more complex. Whereas if you're a corporate venture builder, you can actually start looking, and we have a lot of discussions with people that have started looking within their own supply chain and saying, hey, you know, I don't know how to solve this, but if we solve this, it creates a huge uplift for me, for my competitors, and for the whole industry. So I think that is a key, you know, that is a key way going forward.
All right, thank you, Ziv. And now we have another question that I think is quite interesting here. So it's from Pedro Uriaricio. Does the corporate needs to ultimately provide 100% of the investments, or are there mixed investment models with venture builders and others? Perhaps Joaquin would like to try answering this one.
With pleasure. Yes, thank you. Another great one. Thank you, Pedro, for this one. Short answer here, no. You don't need to provide 100% of the investment. Even more than that, I think there's a strong case to make not to provide 100% of the investment. Let us start with, you know, how we at FutureLabs build ventures. It is true taking an equity stake in the business as well. Yeah, so we build for equity, and therefore we are fully aligned with the payoff of an entrepreneur. And talking about an entrepreneur is happy to assume a lot of risk, but of course that means that he or she needs to have an upside in the equity as well. Yeah, so investment relates to the cap table. We very much believe in what we call the best owner principle. And that means, very practically speaking, that enterprises are good in managing enterprises and in controlling, managing risks. But that is not what you need if you start a venture. Yeah, an enterprise manager, right, a corporate manager, doesn't necessarily make for the best founder of a business. And therefore, in order to align the interest and attract the best possible talent, you need to throw equity into the mix. Yeah. So understanding how that needs to be balanced, how that risk-reward payoff needs to be structured is a key element of designing a core or a successful corporate venture program. Especially, I would say, when there's external venture builders, external entrepreneurs involved, and people from within inside the corporate, right? Because then you get different risk profiles and different incentive structures typically.
All right, thank you. So for the next question, perhaps Ziv will be interested in answering this one. It's from Ponaro AP, and it's about the difference between corporate accelerator and corporate venture building. Perhaps you can give us more details regarding this?
Yes. And we've seen that a lot. In fact, I mean, going back to Tamana's earlier question about what is the difference between a corporate accelerator and a corporate venture building. I think the corporate venture building starts from trying to find a problem that the corporate actually deeply cares about. So, and let's separate. So in fact, I think there's almost a spectrum. This one side of the spectrum is digital transformation, in which you really transform current operations of the business, digitally and whatnot. Another end of the spectrum, I think, in my mind at least, is the accelerator model, where as a corporate, you're saying, I would like to meet up with the most exciting type of entrepreneurs, ventures, etc., that's out there. The corporate venture building, as we envision it, is somewhere in the middle, meaning that we start with what are the key problems that a specific corporate is trying to solve, and how does the corporate venture, in addition for being a commercial success, can solve for for the corporate. So I'll give you an example. One of the ventures that I'm working on in Indonesia is with a bank that is looking to increase their number of new to bank customers. And of course, they can compete with other banks around the ideas of lower cost of loans and whatnot. But that is a very straight up competition that a minor might not win. On the other hand, where they came up with their venture building program, they actually said, we want to create ventures that will provide a gateway for potential customers to engage with us. So we create a venture that might be unrelated, but on the other hand, when they use their payments, when they use loans and whatever it is, it flows through the bank. And so the venture that we're building, in this case, into the insurtech space, allows them to engage with potential customers in a way that actually contributes to their KPI, even outside from this being an investable venture. And for me, that is a key difference between an accelerator and what we're trying to do in very specific corporate venture building.
All right, thank you, Zif. So I want to direct the next questions to Tamana. So I noticed that there are some questions here related to how corporate and startups can work together and even maybe in some cases compete. Like for example, we have one from Yip. How do corporate ventures source for promising startups? And as a startup, how do we approach them?
So this actually goes back to, what kind of approach they are taking or what kind of partner they are working with. So if we were just talking about accelerator, and typically when corporates undertake an accelerator, they have a partner that helps them to source these startups. And the corporate really needs to identify what are a few topics they are more interested in, define a bit of the assets they are willing to sort of give access to, but it comes down to this external partner who is going to then run the accelerator for them, who's going to source the startups. Many times before coming into FutureLabs, I was working into a corporate innovation role as well. So it was a responsibility of the innovation team itself to be out with the ecosystem, know who are the latest and sort of new interesting startups that are coming up. So we were really listening out to in the ecosystem to the conferences and so on to identify these companies as well. So it depends on those. I think there are a lot of now databases that enable that. So as corporate venture builders, when we partner a corporate now, we first focus on identifying the problem or the opportunity areas that we want to build out. And then we help to out and identify the startups that actually meet the criteria that corporate is looking at as well. So I think there is a multitude of sources. It's what is most important maybe for the startup that would like to identify this corporate partner. I always say is to have a clear proposition and a clear ask. And then if for example, if I'm a logistics company and you think you have something interesting for a logistics company, you really need to talk about it. You need to make that case, and then the companies can find you quite easily as well. So to be clear, which are the corporate partners that have most value for you, where you have the most to add and you would really like to work with to really talk about that. And then I'm sure then you find a way to engage with those, because most corporates are right now really looking at engaging with startups in one way or another.
All right, thank you. So the next one is it's about when startups have to compete with a corporate, especially when they're come up with a similar product. So this is from Edwin Law. What are your thoughts and advice on when CVCs are launching competing products as with a startup after, like, for example, talking to the startup itself? So how can startup protect their ideas here?
So this is a very sensitive question, especially after a week after the Wall Street Journal published an article that Amazon has done just that, right? I don't know if all of you have read it, but it is quite sensitive and it's quite pertinent.
Yes. Exactly.
I think, and this is the unfortunate, kind of the unfortunate reality in the current investment world, is that it's quite difficult for ventures to protect themselves. I mean, no NDA and no NDA and whatnot is normally able to protect from that, right? And as we see even in the hearings in the US with what has happened, with the discussion with Facebook and all of these things, is that obviously the big companies have a bigger way of actually actually protecting themselves versus the small ventures. The only way then you could actually do is to simply execute better. I think in this region specifically, what you would see is that, and I think this is the example, by the way, of the e-commerce players in Indonesia. Blibli, which is the only one that survived. I mean, I've spoken with telcos about Elevenia. There was another one that done by, there was quite a few other players of e-commerce that were tried to do it. And all of them actually failed. And at the end of the day, Tokopedia was completely unaligned, and Lazada, that started as a venture building exercise, have actually won the market. The outcome of that is essentially suggested that it really depends on the group of entrepreneurs and how they're actually doing it. I don't think, and from the entrepreneurs, I would say you need to be very careful about which corporate you want to engage with, and look for signs of where things might not work out well. I don't think anyone has an intention, and I hope even Amazon doesn't, to steal the trade secrets or the startups that are of their ventures, right, that they're actually engaging with. But obviously as an entrepreneur, this is your baby. You need to be really, really careful on how you engage. I think it is a very sad case in terms of what was published.
All right, thank you everyone. So we're almost at the end of the session. So do you guys have like any closing statement that you would like to convey to the attendees?
I saw actually another question popping by that I want to take, which is the question: 1 out of 8. How is it formulated? 1 out of 8 of the ventures. It's going back to the statistic I think I present. 1 over 8 of the corporate venture succeeds, but that means that 7 out of 8 still fails. Yeah? So that's a great question actually. Why is that? Look, I would name 4, perhaps 5 main factors. I think fundamentally, culture. There's a fundamental discord between, call it the DNA and the pressures of a corporate and a startup. And once you dabble into, corporate venturing, we see that, as things become tense and difficult, corporates tend to get cold feet and they pull out, right? Because they have at some point more to lose. The people who are managing it have more to lose than to win. One. Also on the other side of the spectrum, actually, we see that there's a risk of overinvestments, where once a corporate embarks on a corporate venture building journey, they are unwilling to pull the plug. And that is especially true if they start with the wrong expectations and the wrong intentions. Because, making a bet on one company, if you do that, you're unlikely going to want to, walk away from it, right? So it's very hard to kill your own darling, right? The company that you build, but that's actually the discipline you need to have as an entrepreneur. And then the other ones, without going into too much detail, is the infrastructure. Look, as a corporate venture, you want to get as much as you want from the infrastructure, use the corporate assets as much as you want. but actually you don't want to have to live up to all the limitations and liabilities that come with it, right? From email infrastructure and cloud infrastructure and office access and what have you. Actually, a lot of this, if not well executed, becomes an impediment, becomes a burden onto a corporate venture. And the last one I already tackled, at least in short, which was the incentive and the ownership structure and the type of talent that you attract with that. Yeah. So I would name, thanks for that question, but I would name those three or four drivers here. Yeah.
Let me also address Pedro's question, because I know we skipped his first one because we weren't able to really answer about South Africa, but I think his governance question about corporate building is super important, and maybe that would be my parting thoughts. Mm-hmm. But basically, I think there's two elements to that, right? Number one would be addressing the root cause of why does corporate wants governance control, and we see that all the time, right? And it normally stems from two or three reasons. One of them is to manage their risk. Another one is to ensure that they get the return on investment. Right? And the third one is just of uncertainty. What we have done in our engagements with corporates is to try to separate how we address each one of these issues separately. So lowering risk, I think, can be managed quite separately. Return on investment, this is where addressing KPIs of the corporate can actually help them get a better return on investment and whatnot. On the other side is how do you build the right governance? And this is where, as a venture builder, this is part of our role. So where we come in, for example, our goal is to establish a 3-person board, and therefore the entrepreneur, right, the venture founder is one of the board member, us would be another board member, and then the corporate partner would be a third one. So again, there's multiple ways to do that in terms of governance, but we do recognize that this is exactly one of the nuanced points as we try to leverage assets and deliver the value for all sides.
Okay.
Anisa, I'm going to pick up on your cue with one concluding thought. There's a new book published by one of the co-founders of Netflix, and he says nobody knows anything. And I love it because when he went to market with the idea of Netflix, no one believed him, right? I mean, there's many stories like this. But what this really means is that we can talk about, an idea, including corporate venturing, as long as we want, right? And try and intellectualize about it for a year, right? Which is a useful exercise. But at the end of the day, my bias, and I know Ziv bias, Amana's bias is, let's go and do it, right? Let's test an idea, even if it's a half-baked idea. Let's test it in the market. Let's put not $1 million on the table. Let's put a few $10,000 on the table, go and validate it in the market, create that traction, and then all conversations become much easier, right? So that is really the call or the approach that we have. And if you're interested in either intellectualizing or really testing a few ideas in the market and see how far corporate venturing would go for your organization, just reach out. LinkedIn is probably the best way to find us.
All right, great. And Tamana, any closing statement for our attendees?
No, I want to just thank everybody for joining today. I hope you found it interesting and you know how to find us. So you can find us on LinkedIn, drop us a note, email at inquiry@futurelabs.vc. So feel free to reach out. And if any of you are interested also in seeing the results of the mini survey that we did, feel free to reach out to us. But thanks for joining, and we will look forward.
Thank you.
All right, great. So before we end this, I would like to make some announcement. So next week, we'll be back with 27 webinars, and this time we're going to have Ms. Anne Karen, people strategy consultant and author of the book From Zero to 100, How to Grow Your Startup Workforce. So this is going to happen on August 12th, 2 p.m. Singapore time. And then we'd also like to remind you that we're going to have a survey shortly after the webinar. And please take the time to let us know the topics or the speakers that you would like to see in these events. Also, don't forget, the E27 team is always reachable through this platform. And then lastly, I would like to thank everyone for tuning in, and then for all the panelists for their amazing presentation. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Please take care and stay safe, and see you in the next episode of E27 webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Bye.